Welcome back everyone to another tutorial with Hemi. Today we will be looking at how to compose cinematic heroic music like Christophe Beck's Ant-Man soundtrack. And I will show you the kinds of approaches Christophe used in his music, and we will explore the specific elements and orchestration techniques you can bring together to create your own version of heroic music. So I wanted to compose something similar to Ant-Man Quantum Mania. Now I couldn't just take the original Ant-Man soundtrack and show you how to orchestrate it. That would definitely land me a copyright claim. So instead I analyzed the theme music and then I created a composition that uses my personal style while still sounding similar to Ant-Man. Christophe Beck or his orchestrators often uses a mix of half electronic and half orchestral instruments. This is a technique you should definitely utilize in your own production, especially if you're working on a smaller budget production and relying solely on VST instruments instead of live recording sessions. This is because, unfortunately, VST instruments alone often do not give you the same realistic sound you get with live players. That said, instead of pursuing a super realistic orchestral sound, which would mean spending a lot of money buying new libraries for strings, brass, and woodwinds, we can focus on using non-orchestral elements. This helps counterbalance the fake sounding of the virtual orchestra and adds a unique, modern character to your music. The main non-orchestral VSTs I'm using in this piece are Analog Lab by Arturia, Lunasys Cube, and a few other smaller plugins. If you have watched Ant-Man, you know that Ant-Man can shrink to the size of an ant, and in the Quantum Mania movie he shrinks down to the subatomic level and explores the quantum realm, which is a separate dimension. So the idea here is to use sound to represent the mysterious qualities of that subatomic world, a place outside of normal physical laws. This instrument is literally called Atoms, which comes from Analog Lab. I added another similar instrument to fill up the mid-range of the frequency spectrum. We want these unique sounds that represent atoms to feel present everywhere in the atmosphere. This is a customized instrument within Zebra 2. We will use it to represent the random movement of atoms. Do atoms actually move randomly? I can't say for sure, but let's just imagine they do in the movie. I'll talk more about the different instrument choices as we move along in the rest of the tutorial. The orchestral instruments we're using here are very similar to the ones in Ant-Man. I also added some sound effects and VST synth layers in the DAW, such as this violin SFX that doubles the violins. Later in the breakdown section, I'll show you in detail how all the instruments work together and what libraries I use. Starting at the very top, we have this digital flute playing on ottava. We're using this instead of a traditional piccolo because later in the piece we have some extremely high notes that are outside of a piccolo's range. Next, in the woodwind section, we have flute, oboe, the clarinet group, and bassoon. And then we have the entire brass section, and you may notice that I've included the cimbasso. The cimbasso is a very interesting instrument. It can be used for creating some accented attacks with very saturated clarity. This is also used by Christophe in his Ant-Man music, and it works fantastically when overlapping with the rest of the brass instruments. Next up, we have the percussion group, the synthesizers for electronic layers, and the violins 1, 2, 3, violas, cello, and contrabass. The speed of this music needs to be very fast. The original Ant-Man theme is set to 170 BPM per minute in a 7/4 time signature. Now here's another critical thing to consider when you're writing super fast action sequences. You need to predetermine which instrument part you will record with live players and which you will use VST instruments. This is because there are physical limitations to how fast the players can play the passages. Let's take our piece Quantum Man as an example. In passages like this one, set at a speed of 165 BPM, it is extremely difficult, nearly impossible, to play this fast and have all the players remain perfectly in sync. Remember, you usually have 2 to 4 flute players doubling the part. You may just use one flute player, but that will give the wind section a very transparent sound. So the most practical solution for this virtuosic passage is to use VST instruments. Based on my past experience working with composers on TV shows and movies, including productions in Asia, the Middle East, and other countries, I can share a universal rule regarding live recording. When it comes to recording, harp and percussion usually do not need to be recorded live. High quality VSTs often work well here. Strings and brass almost always benefit from being recorded live to capture that realistic emotional sound. Woodwinds are a bit tricky. They generally don't need to be recorded live unless there are very long melodic or solo passages. Christophe Beck used the time signature 7/4. This is known as a complex time signature, and it is also known as an asymmetrical or irregular time signature. You can find this type of signature in classical works like the finale to Stravinsky's The Firebird. For action music like the theme in Ant-Man, using complex time signature is a very interesting choice. This is because complex meters help you avoid the common grounded and march-like feeling you get from simple time signatures. And simple time includes our most familiar ones like 2/4, 4/4, 3/8. Many fellow musicians say that I like to stick to 3/4 or 4/4, while this time we're using 12/8, a compound time signature. This choice doesn't have any specific symbolic meaning by itself, but if you look at bar 21, where we have these cascading woodwind notes, I wanted to group all of them into the same bar to create a forward motion. And to fit this idea, the time signature that worked the best for that rhythmic grouping was 12/8. So we're looking at the entire piece here. I've divided it into 6 parts, and we will go through them one by one. It's always a good idea to add one bar at the beginning because sometimes you may have pickup notes or you may have some articulation markings. There are a few ways to set that up. In Reaper, you can simply set the start measure to 0 and then bar 1 will begin on the second bar of your project. At the beginning, we're only using 4 instruments: the cello, the viola, the drum kit, and the horn, and the main melody is played by the horn. This patch is from Spitfire Symphony Orchestra. Even though it's a VST instrument, the texture is very close to the horn used in the Ant-Man soundtrack. To create a mysterious atmosphere, I'm using viola and cello pizzicato for accompaniment. We also begin with a very soft dynamic, almost like Quantum Man is quietly starting his espionage mission. Now, why aren't we adding violin pizzicato on top of the violas and cellos? The reason is that the violins tend to sound too crisp and exposed. We want that mysterious and more hidden tone here. With the violins, the sound becomes too bright and obvious. You don't want to reveal Quantum Man to the enemy just yet. It's the same idea with the percussion. We don't want anything too dramatic. We're just letting it follow the same rhythmic pattern as the pizzicato strings here. So we have 4 bars, and for the rest of the 4 bars in part 1, we want to push the music to a climax. And to do that, we're adding sustained notes with a crescendo. And here we're using 2 violin divises. Since we're not using light players, I'm just going to label this as violin 1, 2, 3 instead of using divisi markings. So we want the volume to build gradually. The violin 1 will begin first, and then violin divisi 2 joins. At the same time, the contrabass is moving downward, and this descending line adds some tension and signals that the emotion is becoming unstable. I also added tremolo to the last few notes here, and that creates even more of that instability. If your orchestration ever feels too dry or thin, it's always a good idea to check if the horn or trombone parts are well integrated. When I first wrote this section, I actually didn't have the trombones yet. If I mute the trombones, and if we take a listen to it, you might hear that something feels missing. We could just add a riser, which I did here, and also a timpani roll, but we want more power, and your body of your mix usually comes from the mid to low frequency range. We already have the horns playing the melody, so the next instrument we can consider is the trombone. So I let the trombones follow the harmony in the range between C3 and C5. And that gives us exactly extra density and weight we need. Part 2, we had this huge body of instruments playing in unison. The idea is borrowed from Christophe Beck's Ant-Man theme from Quantum Mania. And just a reminder, you can download the sheet music from my MuseScore page, and I put the link in the description. I intentionally left out some of the high-range woodwinds, and why is that? It is because in this section they don't add much to the overall texture. Brass instruments can easily overpower the woodwinds, and the timbre of the winds is usually too soft to cut through the mix. Let's look at some of the doubling rules here. The clarinets are doubling the violins. Then we have a violin divisi playing an octave lower together with the horns. Then the violas are doubling the cello and the bass clarinet. Note that the strings here are marked staccato and marcato, which means staccato and marcato. E means and in Italian. The contrabass is doubling the contrabass clarinet. We're leaving out the bassoon just because it's very hard to hear when it's playing in a loud unison texture. We could move it to a higher register, but I personally don't really like the nasal sound it produces. Well, I guess there's no harm to leave it there. I'm also leaving out the trumpets here because I want to save them for the final big climax at the end. And we haven't talked about the trombones and the cimbasso yet. And these two usually double each other and stay in the lower register. For the percussion section, I actually changed a little bit in the DAW. Even though the score has tom-toms and the drum set, I didn't end up using the exact instruments in the DAW. I'm using the Hans Zimmer percussion library. And the crash cymbal sound is actually a recording from the Stylophone beat machine. At the bottom, I added some attacks. And the piano is playing parallel eighth notes. And this is also where the bass synth comes in. This climax lasts for 4 bars, and in the third bar we're bringing in another violin divisi in the high register to heighten the tension. And in our DAW, there are 2 SFX. The first layer is from Cube. And the second layer is from Random Metal. This is where things start to get interesting. The violins are now playing a variation of the main theme. You might notice that in the DAW, I'm using several violin patches, even though we only have 1 violin divisi playing the melody at the moment. Here's a trick. If your VST violin ever sounds too unrealistic or too isolated, try doubling it with 1 or 2 more violin patches from different libraries. Stacking libraries can make the sound fuller and much more natural. Another instrument doubling the violin line is this pad from Analog Lab. I added to create a subtle glitchy texture. After all, the journey into the quantum realm isn't supposed to feel so smooth. We want to keep the rhythmic momentum going here, ta 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 ta. So the rest of the strings, except the contrabass, are playing staccato. The synth bass is also following the same rhythmic pattern, and it continues for most of the piece. Let's have a listen to the bass in the DAW. The bass sound is from the library Bass Synths by Wave Alchemy. And above that, we have another synth from Analog Lab. I really like the sounding of it. It sounds stubborn, almost like a robot that refuses to stop and just keeps going forward. Now we want to add the quantum elements into the composition, and for this I specifically chose an instrument from Zebra 2. The notes were generated by Stoker's sequencer. Stoker's is a probabilistic polyrhythmic sequencer plugin. What it's doing here is taking the notes from Zebra 2, and based on your programming, it creates this randomized sequences that you can then record into your DAW. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a way to make it synchronize properly with the 12/8 time signature. So when I was recording, I temporarily changed the time signature to 4/4 in order to record the sequence correctly. The second quantum element, which I have mentioned earlier, is the Atoms instrument from Analog Lab. When you layer these 2 sounds together, they create this magical and sci-fi atmosphere. Here we have the violins playing sartasto, followed by these intervals. And the bassoon enters with a counter melody. Now let's take a look at part 4. Part 4 only has 8 bars, but there's a lot of stuff going on. Part 4 begins at bar 21 in the score, At the very top, we have these atoms playing these arpeggios. The phrasing here is slightly different from what we had in part 3. And this is what we had in part 3. So we only let it play occasionally because there's so many other instruments playing at the same time. And we want to avoid overcrowding the texture. Next, we bring back this white noise instrument. It plays a single note at the beginning of each bar. And at bar 3, we give it a rest, and then it continues again in the following bars. Now that all of the SFX layers are established, let's scroll down and take a look at the melody section. So remember in part 3 the violins were carrying the main melody, and in part 4 we passed that responsibility over to the trombones. It's like in a conversation you always want to give the other person a chance to speak. Now we bring the violins back in. Almost as if the violins are agreeing with the trombone's statement and speaking the answer out loud together. It's like when you ask someone, which YouTube channel should I subscribe to if I want to learn cinematic composing? And both you and the other person reply in unison, it must be hemi-cinematic. Now what about the rest of the string section? Let's take a look at the score. You will notice they continue playing the staccato figures underneath and providing support and driving the rhythm forward. Let's have a listen to the strings and trombones together. Okay, so here we're adding the horns to give the body a fuller sound. I've also marked the dynamic changes here. There's this undulating motion in the dynamics. At the end of the phrase, I'm adding a trumpet growl and a flutter tone. So on trumpet, you can actually perform the growl and the flutter at the same time. And the same technique applies to trombones. I'm using a bass trombone here instead of a trombone, which is fine. Next, we have the woodwind section, which is playing the super fast 16th notes. In the DAW, I pan the digital flute and the flutes to the right, and oboes and clarinets to the left. And this goes from right to left, giving a little bit of 3D effect. And then we have the bassoons doubling the main melody. In part 4, I added some drum beats. You could use a loop if you want. I know a lot of musicians do that, but here I wrote the beats myself because they just fit better to the dynamics of this piece. And earlier in this piece, we had the shakers at the beginning, and we're reusing them here. And of course, we need some timpani hits. Timpani is great whenever you want to create an epic moment. If you want to learn how to write epic drum beats, I have a video on that. You can click on the prompt on the top right, or you can find the link in the description below. And finally, at the bottom, we have the synth group, which is doing something quite similar to the previous part. Part 5 is my favorite moment. Here I use both subtractive and additive orchestration. And subtractive orchestration refers to reducing instruments sequentially or unlayering the instruments, while additive orchestration is the opposite, gradually adding layers of instruments. Both techniques gradually change the density and the color of the music. You can hear this kind of technique in many modern works. For example, Steve Reich's Music for Pieces of Wood, a minimalist composition for 5 claves, starts with one performer playing and then the rest of the percussionists join in one by one. In our piece, we start by removing the layers until only the synth space remains. And then we begin to introduce new instruments, mostly pads and SFX. For the pads, I'm using the instruments from Lunacy's Cube. So pad 2 starts first and then pad 1 joins near the end to help push toward the final climax. I've added a lead sound also from Lunacy called Dune Walker, and the magic here is that you can actually pitch bend to create this otherworldly sci-fi-like sliding effect. It's a bit tricky to control with the pitch bend wheel in real time, so I just went into the MIDI editor and drew it with the pen. And on top of that, I added another high frequency pad. Imagine Quantum Man navigating through the quantum realm in his hovercar or spaceship and getting completely lost. And by the end, maybe his vehicle picks up a signal, and that saturated buzzing sound represents the beacon. At the top, we have a whole group of SFX, and the first sound I'm using is the post-rock cinematic keys from Cube. And the second one is Quarks. And then there is Quambi. I also added an owl sound. This one is just a royalty-free audio file. And after that, we have the space intermission. And this effect is from Zebra 2. So at this moment at bar 55, we start to bring back the rest of the instruments one by one. So we start with violin DVZ1 and DVZ2 playing staccato. And after 2 bars, we will bring back the violas together with the Stoker sequencer. Next, the cello, oboes, and the clarinets. Next, the flutes, and then violin DVZ3. And near the end of this part, we bring back the trombones 4 bars before the climax, and the contrabass is playing pizzicato together with the synth layer just 3 bars before the climax, and those shakers 2 bars before the climax. And one more thing I added, which isn't in the score, was a riser here. The instrumentation in the final climax is pretty much the same as in part 2, except I added the trumpet layer to make the moment even more dramatic. And I also extended the section by 3 more bars with slightly different harmony. And the reason it ends on an incomplete sentence is to create a dramatic, interrupted feeling, almost like a cliffhanger. And after that, the rest of the piece gradually fades out. I specifically added a EQ for the winds, so they sound more muted and distant. This is also marked in the score, indicating only low frequencies should come through. And at the very end, the violin DVZ1 plays saltasto, and all instruments finish at pianissimo. everyone for watching this tutorial. I hope you've learned a lot and feel ready to create your own superhero music. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and I will see you next time. This video is brought to you by Boom Lights, and this is Noise. If you followed along to this point, you've already seen how much visuals matter alongside the music. Good lighting can boost the whole experience just like good orchestration can. That's why I want to introduce you to the LC1X Plus, a fully programmable lighting unit made for DMX lights and LED strips, designed specifically for musicians and creators. Simply plug it into your computer, connect your DMX lights or LED strips, and program everything right inside your DAW. The LC1X Plus can control up to 128 DMX channels, with each channel mapped to a MIDI node that controls RGB values of the light. If you're a musician, producer, or creator looking to take your live show or studio visuals to the next level, definitely check out the LC1X Plus. All the links and details are in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next one.